it's a lot better if the head of sales goes to the CEO and says, the L&D department delivered this program to my organization and our sales went up by $10 million, because that's got credibility.
Welcome to the LearnOps Leadership Series. Today our guest is Nick Howe, the former CLO of Hitachi and most formerly CLO of Area9 Learning. Welcome, Nick.
Thank you, Ryan. Before we get too far into it, I just want to correct things. I would love to have been the CLO of the full Hitachi business, which is a $100 billion global company. I was the head of learning for one of the larger divisions. We were doing about 4 or 5 billion in revenue. So still sizable and still a complex operation, but not quite the full company.
That's a great lead into the purpose of LearnOps leadership, everything operational. And you know, I have had conversations in the past about how Hitachi was even more complex on the operational side, given the nature of your customers in that business. Before we kind of jump into everything there, I'm curious, how did you even get into learning and development? I'm always so interested in learning people's story.
Yeah, like many people, it was in the industry, it was a little bit of an accident. So I'm an engineer and a business leader by background, but I've always been interested in change and driving change. And I was leading one of Hitachi's services businesses. And as part of that, I inherited our customer education business. And I'm sure we'll get into this later as we talk about complex operations, complex L&D operations. But we had the internal employee development, but we also had a for-profit employee business, which rolled up into my P&L. For-profit customer business that rolled up into my P&L. And I inherited that, and I found that I really enjoyed that part of the business. So I asked the then CEO if I could take a more direct role in the overall education part of the business, and ended up, fortunately, running it for a dozen years.
In your opinion, what are the main challenges between internal customers and external customers, given that in that role you were helping to develop solutions for external customers?
There's a lot of similarities, but also a lot of differences, as you alluded to. The core of it is the same. You know, we were producing learning, and ultimately, I suppose we should get this out of the way early on as well, because I think it underpins everything about LearnOps. Why do L&D departments exist? You know, and in my opinion, it is not to produce training output, which is how a lot of people think of it. Our job was to drive business outcome through people. Right? It was about helping to change behavior, whether that was empowering our employees to do things differently or better or develop their careers, or whether it was in the external part of the company to help our resellers be successful selling and servicing our solutions, or whether it was about customers successfully using our solutions. Ultimately, it's all about the business outcome that you're going to get from those interventions. There are some operational differences. You know, part of it we run as a cost center, part of it we run as a full P&L as a business, and we can get into some of the details of that one. So overall, we ran it as a single entity with different audiences, with different drivers, with different stakeholders. But a lot of the efficiencies that we managed to drive in the business came as a result of merging those three different audiences from an operational point of view.
I know that, and I recognize that you're saying there's not a lot of difference between internal customers and external customers. How about from operational structures and how the teams are set up? Is there any difference between how you see L&D teams set up if they're focused on internal customers versus external customers?
No, I've spoken to a lot of different CLOs over the years. I mean, particularly, the division of Hitachi that I was working for was focused very much in the tech space. So we were producing, multi-million, sometimes multi-$100 million IT solutions. And it's very common in the IT industry, in the IT sector, to have this extended value chain with regard to who your audiences are. And so what I've seen talking to other CLOs is that there are a lot of similarities. The way that you develop training for a customer is largely the same as you develop training for an employee. There are some significant differences. There ought to be much more focus on kind of the marketing and demand side when it comes to customer education or even reseller education. They have a choice typically whether they take the training or not. For a lot of the employee things that we were doing, sales enablement, services enablement, it's kind of expected or in some cases mandated that the employees are going to take that. But the focus on things like effectiveness, in my opinion, should be the same. You don't want to waste people's time. You want to give them good, high quality content. You want to make sure that it's aligned to the outcomes that you're looking for and the outcomes that they're looking for. So the way that you do needs analysis should be very, very similar across all those audiences. The way that you maybe manage the P&L, the way that you decide to allocate spend is going to vary. And some of the conversations you have with stakeholders, and I know you and I have spoken in the past about analytics, and we may well get into that, the types of information and data that you provide to your stakeholders that show the progress that you've made serving those different audiences is going to vary. But as I said before, the efficiencies you can get come from making those as consistent as you possibly can while recognizing that you are trying to achieve some different outcomes.
When we talk to some of our customers, we see that it really varies. Sometimes customers say that they're not so focused on the budget or P&L side of learning investments, more focused around the learner outcomes. And some actually do talk about learner outcomes, business outcomes, and are focused on how to tie it back to actual ROI and profit and loss of the business unit. In your opinion, what do you think the best view is for an L&D leader? Should it be more focused on just the business outcome and the learner outcome? Should they be thinking about how to tie it back to the budget where they're treating learning and development like a business? Any feedback on that?
I have a lot of feedback. How much time do we have for this? I think there's a danger that you set up a false dichotomy, right? Do we focus on the budget or do we focus on outcomes? You don't have a choice. You have to focus on both, unless you are in that luxury situation where the CEO is just raining money down on you and you don't care. I've never met a CLO who's in that position. There's a fundamental question that I asked my team and I've asked other CLOs, which is why do L&D departments even exist? Right? We are not the Holy Grail. We are not the only custodians of learning, right? We don't sit on the top of some mountain and have people come to us as the gurus of everything to do with learning. You can learn in any kind of way, right? If the L&D department disappeared tomorrow, learning would not stop. People are going to read. They're going to speak to their colleagues. They're going to watch videos. They're going to experiment. So learning is going on with or without the L&D department. The question is, why should an L&D department exist? Why should the CEO commit budget to an L&D department? And from my perspective, that's because we should be the most effective and efficient way to achieve the outcomes through human capital, right? You create an L&D department because there is science associated with this that isn't commonly known. And that's one of the big things that people often forget. We've all been through school. We all think we know how to do teaching. Well, sorry, we don't. There are some very specific disciplines associated with that, and concentrating those in an L&D department makes a lot of sense. But because of that, you then have an obligation back to the company to spend the company's money wisely. There is no excuse for not running L&D like a business. Cash flow is king. You've got to manage your spend. You need to know exactly what money's coming in and exactly where you're spending the money. And how is that money translating into outcomes? The question that used to keep me up at night was the CEO calling me and saying, so what am I getting for this money that I'm giving to you? And that is not, well, we trained 1,000 people, or we delivered 100 programs. Those are things that you absolutely need to keep track of internally. I need to know, did this program cost more than that program? Did we reach the audience that we thought we were going to reach? How did the stakeholder define their goals, and did we meet those goals? That's all basic operations that unfortunately a lot of people don't have a handle on, but is absolutely the license to play the game. Right? We all want to, there's been this thing around for years, a seat at the table. How do we, relate to business leaders? Well, step number one is run your business properly. Right? You don't expect the COO of the company who's overseeing all the factories to have no clue about how much money is being spent or whether the factories are running optimally. You have to deliver back to the business the answers to the questions that any other business leader ought to be able to answer. But then in addition to that, you have a specialism. And we need to understand what are the impacts of those programs that we're developing. Are we doing the things that we say we're going to do, which is build skill and competence in a particular audience? A, do we understand what we're trying to do? B, did we successfully design programs to achieve that outcome? And did those programs meet those outcomes in terms of things that we can measure? And sorry, this is a bit of a long rambling answer, but I'll close it out with that ROI. There's this ROI question that everybody keeps coming back to. I think there is, as an industry, we've done ourselves a bit of a disservice over the last 10 years, or maybe even longer than that. With this big focus on ROI, there is this temptation to want to always translate everything we do into dollars and cents. Unfortunately, a lot of those things are completely out of our control. I think there is a temptation to want to justify what we do in terms of dollars and cents and growing the sales pipeline or, introducing operational efficiencies into the business. But ultimately, those things are completely out of our control. The only things that we have control over are the quality of our programs and whether we are delivering effective learning interventions. And those you can measure scientifically, and we often don't do that. So for me, question number one is, can you actually tell whether people learned anything or not? Right? Whether it's a hypo program or whether it's how to change a widget. You've designed your program to drive business behavior change through new skill and knowledge. Did people actually get new skill and knowledge? If you can't answer that question, and often people can't, they know what the satisfaction score was and they know how many people they trained. They don't actually know whether anybody learned anything or not. Well, if you can't measure that, then I would argue pack up and go home, because you've fundamentally missed the point. Then and only then, once you know that you've made a change to the business, once you've done what you said you're going to do, then you can start looking at, can I translate this into business numbers that other people might care about? But I would argue you can only do that in partnership with your stakeholders. So this goes back to what we were talking about earlier, which is then as I deliver those programs, how can I provide analytics that allow me to have a robust conversation with my stakeholders that gets them to the point where they say, yes, this made a difference to the business? Because that's ultimately, I think that's what you want. I can go to the CEO and say, we ran this program for sales, we trained 1,000 people, we increased all their knowledge, and sales went up, and that's great. And we delivered $10 million of value to the business. And that's a wonderful claim to be able to make. It's a lot better if the head of sales goes to the CEO and says, the L&D department delivered this program to my organization and our sales went up by $10 million. Because that's got credibility. The challenge that I always had dealing with analytics with the C-suite was, are you actually in a position to make that claim, and how much do they trust that claim? And if you can partner with the business leader and they can make that claim on your behalf, it's a slam dunk. But there's an awful lot of moving parts you've got to have in place in order for all those things to line up to get to that point.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. And I think that's why some of our more successful customers are when they're set up in a federated model, for example, a federated operating model where they literally have these learning business partners implanted inside of these departments outside of L&D to help drive business outcomes and tie back data to the more enterprise layer of L&D as well. That makes a lot of sense. Before, I do have some questions in how to get to the analytics and the data, but before we jump there, do you think because a lot of L&D people are still figuring out how to run L&D like a business and, still caught a little bit into the past of, good learning is measured through evaluation forms or smile sheets at the end of the training and not really being outcomes driven? Where do you see things falling apart? I mean, there's this notion that when there's a problem with the economy or a downturn, L&D is one of the departments that gets impacted. But I think with COVID, the people who were running learning like a business, you saw these companies doubling down on the L&D strategy to train people through this massive change, where then businesses started to skyrocket during times of uncertainty. And a big part of that was from being able to teach people fast enough. So where's the balance, in your opinion, from when, you see downturns, and how does L&D protect themselves? Does that align to how they're structured operationally, do you think?
There's a lot to unpack there. Where to start? So why have people struggled in the past? I think part of it is a lack of skill on behalf of the people leading L&D departments. I was fortunate that I came out of the business, and that was my background. I'd been used to being held accountable for managing a P&L. Some people who move up into L&D leadership positions haven't had that experience. So the combination of expectations from stakeholders and the experience of the people moving into those spots, I think, can create a perfect storm of kind of bad behavior. If the stakeholders of L&D are expecting the L&D department to behave like a business, then clearly that puts an onus on the head of L&D to do that. If that isn't the case, and I think it is true that many business leaders have a very naive view of L&D. The number of times that I had someone come to me, very senior people come to me and say, we need a 3-day program on this. And it's like, well, I don't tell you that you need, a hydraulic press to make this widget. Why are you telling me that you already have decided what the intervention should be to solve this problem? So I think there's a degree of pushback and a degree of recognition that needs to go on, that L&D is a profession with a specific set of skills that can deliver a value. And we almost need to educate our stakeholders to ask the right questions. And then it is our responsibility to step up and deliver like any other business leader would do, right? To manage the budget appropriately, to deliver back analytics that represent the value that we're adding back to the business. The flip side of that, or a corollary to that, I suppose, is that even if those questions are not being asked, I would argue that the L&D leader has a responsibility to do those things anyway, right? Even if they're asking the wrong questions, even if they're saying, how many people did you train? And that's their measure of success. Fine. If that's their measure of success, give them that data. But still, you owe it to the business as a business leader to be looking at your P&L, to be looking at how you're spending your costs, to know how you're managing your people, to know which programs are costing you what amount of money, and is it more efficient and effective to do online interventions versus in-person interventions, and what are the pros and cons of doing those, and all the different analytics that go into running L&D like a business. There's no excuse for not doing that. No excuse for not doing that, right? And it doesn't matter whether it's a federated business or a centralized business, or whether you're part of HR or whether you're part of marketing or anything. That should be any leader who's got any budget in a company should think that way, right? And I think L&D has a responsibility to help make sure that the rest of the company is doing that as well. But we've got to get our own house in order and do that. Then you get into, there's operational differences about how you manage stakeholder expectations in a federated environment versus a centralized environment, how you make appropriate use of the resources that you've got available to you. And again, that gets back to some of the things you and I have spoken about before. First of all, is understand what you've got, understand where the money's being spent, and then you can start to make decisions about, can I even afford to put someone in that part of the business? And sometimes it's about dollars and cents, and sometimes it's about keeping a business leader happy and showing them some love. That there's a combination of art and science in this, but you've got to have all that information to your fingertips. And we can get into the weeds a little bit if you want about how you go about doing that. Because I know we've talked a lot about what you should be doing in terms of outcomes. The question is, so how do you solve that problem?
Yeah, I mean, let's do that. I know that you have a passion for technology. During your career, you've won accolades on most innovative use of learning technology. You've been an instructor for AI and learning technology for Penn for their CLO program. What's your opinion? Do you think technology is the answer to solve some of these challenges?
It's a means to an end. It is not an end in itself. There is a big danger that you get enamored with the technology and think that technology is a solution to all of your problems. Technology is a way of achieving scale, and in some cases is the only way of doing something. If I need to train 10,000 people in a week across 5 continents, then unless I can magic 1,000 instructors out of the middle of nowhere, it doesn't matter how good your instructor-led program is, it ain't gonna work. And technology may be the only solution to do that. But it's a tool. And so there is absolutely one of the disciplines that you need to have in your L&D department is to understand the technologies that are available to you and make judicious use of those. Have a decision-making process where you are very clearly articulating why it makes sense to use this technology in this way, whether that's technology on the back end to help you run the business, to help you collect those metrics, those data points, to understand where you're spending, or whether it's technology on the front end to teach people, right? There have been some fantastic developments over the last decade in using real-time feedback to help people learn better. I'm very frustrated, and that's probably a topic for another podcast, but I'm very frustrated that many of our e-learning tools have become content delivery mechanisms. They are not teaching tools. They are purely a way of getting content in front of people. And we don't help people learn. We just put content in front of them and hope they will learn something. You've got to look at what are the outcomes that you're trying to achieve. Am I trying to decrease my costs? Am I trying to increase my bandwidth? Am I trying to improve scale in terms of reach? Am I trying to find a way of accelerating people's learning? And then look at how technology can help you solve those problems. Technology is kind of is a means to an end. Yes, you probably need an LMS. We can talk about learning experience platforms and all those types of things. But fundamentally, they are a means to an end. And if you don't understand what it is you're trying to achieve, then you're wasting your time and money jumping, into technology.
Do you think that L&D has a lack of technology when it comes to pulling data together? You talked about we can get into the data side of things and get into the weeds of that. Let's do that. Where do you see L&D struggling to gather the data to tell the story behind learning outcomes, business outcomes, tying it back to impact and ROI for these learning investments. Like where do they even start if they don't have anything? How do they pull this together? And what areas, with the limited time that we have today, what areas do you think that they should be focusing on?
It's a big subject, but I'll give you a couple of things. I think the data that is readily available to us today is often not the data that's useful to us. LMSs throw off a ton of data, but a lot of it is not helpful either to run the business or to generate outcomes. Right? How many people you trained and how many programs you have and what type of program they are. I mean, it's good to know, but it's not necessarily going to move the needle. So I would say that there are two areas where we ought to invest more in technology. And if we have to cut back on some other areas to achieve this, I think it's the right thing to do. One is about the contact point with the learner. As I said, I think a lot of the tools that we've been using for a long time do not let us measure whether we're doing the thing we set out to do. Ultimately, we are trying to help people learn things. The LMS doesn't tell us typically whether someone learned anything or not. And it's a huge problem because ultimately that's all we're responsible for. And so the newer breed of particularly online tools that allow us to capture information in real time about whether someone is actually learning something, I think is the next wave and absolutely ought to be something that organizations are investing in. But the other one, and that's very sexy, there's all kinds of AI associated with that, and people can get quite enamored with it. Again, you can waste money if you're not careful, but that's kind of the sexy, shiny end of it. There is a more prosaic part, which is maybe not as sexy, but I think is fundamental, and we haven't done a good job over the years. And that's just how you run your L&D department. Because it's very easy, even in small companies, to start spending a lot of money on L&D and to have a lot of people working in that process. And even if it's not the people who are directly employed by the L&D department, you're making use often of subject matter experts out in the business. And it's very easy to burn a lot of man hours producing learning outcomes and lose track of actually how much company money you're spending doing that. So, and there is a lot of inefficiency that can creep into that process. And I'll give you one very concrete example of that. So we had a sizable budget. It was, well into seven figures. And we were developing 250 programs a year. So we had a lot of moving parts. And because of that, I had a lot of project managers overseeing that. As you would do, you've got to control deadlines and you've got lots of moving parts. How often do we look at? So often we take that as you just need to do that. If I'm spending that amount of money, I've got that many programs, I need project managers and the program office to oversee that. But is that actually the case? Do you need that? Can you use technology to streamline that entire operation? Because a project manager is going to cost you over $100,000 a year. You can do a lot with that kind of money. If I can eliminate a couple of project managers, then that's a huge amount of money that I've suddenly got available to spend on things that will make direct impacts on learners. And for a lot less than that amount of money, I can deploy technologies that help me manage the pipeline, better manage resources, manage the interactions with subject matter experts, keep better track of the inflow and the outflow of the work that's being done. The amount of effort I'd have to do to go to the CLO to go to the CEO to justify a few $100,000 worth of additional expenditure. We all know that when it comes to budgeting time, the likelihood is the budgets are going to get cut, not raised, or that you've got to have a big battle just to keep where you are. If I can suddenly magic a couple of $100,000 out of my budget by taking overhead essentially and repurposing that into a thing that's going to generate direct value, I mean, who can argue with that? Right? That should be a win for any organization anywhere. And historically, we haven't done that. Where we typically run businesses on spreadsheets. We run the L&D department on a spreadsheet. We've lots of manual processes. It's very difficult to get a holistic picture of everything that's going on. Lots of moving parts. You would never run any other part of the business like that. Yet we've got away with that for years in L&D. And I think for relatively modest investments, you can get huge returns, actual hard cash dollar returns that then free up money to spend elsewhere in the organization. And not a lot of CLOs I've had conversations with have thought about it that way, that they just treat the overhead as it's the cost of doing business without necessarily reflecting on, are we actually spending more than we need to in those areas?
That's a good point. I mean, even with entrepreneurship and startups and fast-growing technology companies, you want to stay lean on the people side to have performance on the output side, right? And the more people you have, the more problems that you can have as well. There's a lot more to manage. So, it's important to have great people around you to drive and help to drive these outcomes. You can't do it all by automation, but by using some proper tools, purpose-built tools to solve the problem that can unlock efficiency gains, then you're just going to be more effective and you don't have to be so reliant on people.
I would phrase it slightly differently. I mean, ultimately, you're reliant on people, right? I mean, there's a quote, I forget who it was, but it said, at the end of the day, without people, companies are just depreciating assets. Right. So ultimately, it is about the people, but it's how you make the best use of those people and whether they are wasting their times on non-productive work or whether everything they do is delivering productive outcome. You have to get your house in order. You've got to get the basics right. I mean, we, as an organization, we invested and built our own tool set in order to manage our own business. We had an LMS, right? We had e-learning tools. We were spending millions of dollars a year on those technologies. But we needed to have some basic technologies to run our own business. As, if you're in product management and you're using, Jira and all those other tools and GitHub to manage your development process, where are the tools that let the L&D department manage their process? And I'm not talking about just the tools that a programmer would use in product management or development to build software. I'm on about the tools that you would use to manage that process. And there's been a dearth of that. The LMS vendors have never solved that problem, really. The e-learning authoring tools have never solved that problem. Learning experience doesn't solve that problem. It's just been this weird blind spot. And we ended up developing our own, and I know a number of other organizations that ended up developing their own just so they could manage their business. And, hopefully it doesn't come across as hubris, but I think the better organizations are the ones who recognize that is important, right? And it's a foundational building block. I'm not saying it's more important than the LMS or more important than which e-learning tool you use, but it is certainly as important. Once you get above a certain minimum size, which is pretty small, inefficiencies are going to creep into your business and you're going to start wasting money. And to go back to what I said right at the very beginning, you owe it to the CEO and the rest of the business to spend your budget wisely. And there will be inefficiencies in your business. And you have to be able to see what's going on and manage that effectively, just so that you can deliver everything else that the business is expecting to you.
This has been a really great session, Nick. A lot of insights. We'll have to do some follow-up sessions so we can get more in depth of some of these concepts out to the audience.
As you can tell, I'm somewhat passionate about this.
No, and we are too. That's why we're trying to bring more wisdom and insights to this operational layer of L&D to help these L&D leaders treat L&D like that business, understand how to effectively get there as quickly as possible, and also to help their teams work smarter, not harder, like you corrected me on. So thank you for that, because it's so important. I mean, this is a fundamentally one of the most strategic areas for businesses to quickly improve performance and help solve problems, is to help teach your people how to do things a little bit differently, so together we can get to those outcomes. So this has been a really great session, Nick. I really appreciate your time. Excited to get this out to everybody so that we can help them, again, learn how to operate L&D like a business and to work smarter, not harder. Thank you.
Thanks, Ryan. Appreciate it.
Thanks for tuning in to this series. For more information and content on LearnOps, please like, share, and subscribe. Visit getsynapse.com to learn more about our operations platform.